That's on this extended version of Kivumbi 2017, and in this segment I shall be having a discussion about the state of the nation really with regard to that repeat presidential poll. And my guests with me, I have Marilyn Kamuru, who is a lawyer and also a consultant on governance issues. Javas Bigambo, a governance consultant, will also, an analyst, will be joining us in just a few minutes. Many thanks for joining us this evening, Marilyn. Let's just begin by your observation of how this entire process went for the repeat presidential poll.
Well, it was, again, Kenyans were very peaceful. We're clearly very peaceful people when it comes to voting. Obviously, turnout was low. We're seeing some interesting numbers, but it's very clear that Kenyans did not turn out in the same numbers that they did August 8th. And I think that's an indication of where Kenyans feel we are as a nation. You know, there's an enormous amount of fatigue. But I also think that we had both a boycott, but a protest vote. I think we had Kenyans who were objecting to the type of politics that we're seeing from both parties, and the lack of this politics addressing their day-to-day issues, the issues that they think are meaningful. We've had a nurses' strike for almost 5 months, you know, and even in the intervening period between August 8th and the 26th of October, neither one of those candidates addressed the nurses' strike. You know, so I think that there's a disaffection amongst the population that is not about Raila Odinga or Uhuru Kenyatta. I think perhaps they need to... It's fatigue with a type of politics, with a politics that's not resolving Kenyans' issues. It's a politics of personality. So they have issues that matter to them, and those are what you're hearing about, you know. I mean, you just had your interview with Manoa Ezepizu, and he could not bring himself to just convey condolences.
I could see you were seated right there.
It's incredible. It's unacceptable. And it's because they've made this about them. It's this high-stakes game of political chicken, and Kenyans don't see themselves reflected in anything either of these two men are espousing right now. I shouldn't say Kenyans. I should say some Kenyans don't, because clearly they have support.
Which then makes many people wonder, because it's a problem that we face as Kenyans, a leadership problem.
Yes.
When or where does the solution begin? Because we're kind of stuck with this.
Stuck, right? Well, maybe it's not a leadership problem. Maybe it's a followership problem, right?
Yeah.
Because we can't change either of these two gentlemen right now, but we can certainly change what we expect of them. And I think we kind of have done that. I think part of, at least the way I read the reduced turnout in this October 26th, is Kenyans rejecting some of the things that we heard coming from especially the Jubilee Party around the judiciary. I think part of this is blowback from the way the Jubilee Party addressed and responded to the Supreme Court decision on September 1st. I also think there is a sense in which people feel like there are issues we need to discuss and we're not discussing them. So could we talk about something other than, you know...
Because we're just talking about, you know, party politics, individualistic kind of politics.
Completely.
We're not looking at issues.
We're not looking at issues at all. The economy, you know, so
which has been suffering.
Which has been suffering, and the effect of that on individual citizens, especially when you have day work. So when we have all these extended holidays, what does that mean for you when you work on a daily wage? So I think some of those issues are starting to weigh more heavily, and it is, the disconnection is happening because neither one of these men seems to be conveying any empathy.
And there's been a lot of talk, of course, many Kenyans trying to understand this election, and of course, some understand that it is legal. Then there's a question of legitimacy, and we're hearing a lot of these terms being thrown left and right. Is it a legal election? Is it an illegitimate question? And maybe let me bring in Javas Bigambo, who's just joined us and introduced you. So many thanks for joining us. We've just started this discussion.
Thank you.
And just so that we understand, in light of the kind of turnout we've seen in this presidential poll, in which instance does an election like this, or in what instance can it be termed illegitimate?
I wouldn't arrive at the conclusion that this election is illegitimate.
Because there has been a lot of that being...
Yes, of course, I've seen various terms being thrown around that one illegitimate election, second sham election. But in the end, the last word they use is election.
Yeah.
When you look at the definition provided of the term election by the Black's Law Dictionary, 10th edition, election refers to a process where somebody exercises the right to choose a leader for a particular political office. Exercising that right to choose or to select. When you look at this election as it's been conducted, we have had about 7 candidates. And individuals had the choice to make amongst the 7.
Right.
So the question of whether it was an election or not does not arise. There was an election.
Right.
What then arises is, of course, looking at the issues that were raised by the National Super Alliance, is whether this election indeed meets the best practices, all right, international best practices of conducting an election. But beyond that, there are all those that were termed by the NASA team as the bare minimums, because of which, or because they were not met, they decided to withdraw their right to exercise, to engage or to participate in this election.
Right.
So yes, an election has been conducted.
Right.
That goes down in history.
And meets the legal threshold.
Exactly.
Right.
When you look at the provisions and the definition of the term election and provisions for which, even in the Constitution or the Elections Act, all of them have been met. But we know very well that when we revisit the determination of the Supreme Court in the judgment, the preliminary judgment that was made on the 1st of September,
right,
and the complete judgment that was rendered, is it on the 21st of the same month, then there are all those issues that need to be looked at keenly. And that's why we've seen how IEBC has been conducting the process of releasing results. They have exercised considerable diligence just to be sure that they do not repeat the mistakes that were done in the run-up to the, and on the day of the 8th itself, and even the day after, before they announced the results.
Right.
So while they have exercised a bit of diligence, still we must find ourselves with very hard questions to ask. One, has this election satisfied our democratic process as a country, and does it have the capability to move us forward as a nation? The answer is not in the affirmative, because still we know very well that by the withdrawal of NASA and other fellow citizens who did not participate in this election, various critical questions arise. That how will the now possible president-elect Uhuru Kenyatta lead and guide a nation, half of it remaining behind? And because the answer to that question that I asked initially is not in the affirmative, it is prudent of President Kenyatta to find a way of cohering this nation. And that's why it's important for him to reach out to the opposition leadership and see how this nation can be held together.
Right, and we had that exact conversation with the State House spokesman right here, and I asked him the exact question about
I watched that interview,
forward. Yes.
And I've got issues, of course, with some of the responses that he gave.
Right, and Marilyn was sitting right here.
Yes.
The question of unity is one that everyone, I mean, it's even a blind person can see that there's huge, loud division in the country.
I don't understand this craving that we seem to have for Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga to sit down together. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about are issues that Kenyans have. Again, and I think this is why we're having a problem with this election.
Right.
The politicians had a script. Each side had a script. Kenyans didn't get the memo. Kenyans did not understand. You were just supposed to go, you vote, and msi tulete mambo mengi, ati sijui credibility, transparency, accountability. Those are by the ways. We finish this process, then we can talk to you. And what Kenyans have said is no, we want a credible process. And I think for me that goes back to the election and the legitimacy. So it doesn't mean that there was no election. I completely agree with you. There was an election. But you have to have public trust.
Right.
And IEBC does not have. It has a deficit of public trust. And incredible institutions cannot produce credible results. And so for me, I think what I would prefer is, instead of this conversation about dialogue, we have a conversation about institutions, building trust in public institutions, accountability from August 8th. People need to go to jail. I think that's more important than a dialogue.
Who drives that agenda? Who drives that?
And another question arises. Who determines this trust and the threshold of this trust? Who determines it? And at what point do you determine this trust? And I would go back, for example, to the Isaac Hassan team. You see, remember, they were driven out of town by the opposition, all right? Because of the lack of trust. After being driven out of town and the new team taking position, there was impressive trust, especially even amongst the opposition. The chair of the IEBC today, having confessed to the country and the world at large that he is a lifetime member of ODM, there was trust overwhelming. But in the run-up to the August 8th election, that trust seemed to be diminishing by the day. So question arises, yes, it is a debate that we need not have about the necessity of having credible and strong institutions. But now, we have institutions created even by the Constitution and other statutory bodies. But we see that politicians, some of them, and right now, where we are at as a nation, we are beleaguered by the intrigues of comprada politics. And that is what I think we may find ourselves struggling with for a very long time.
We need to expand a bit more
because look at it this way. When, for example, and with all due respect, the former commissioner, Dr. Akombe, fled and started shouting from the rooftops of New York that you see, IEBC is under the chains of certain powers. Why couldn't she, with all due respect, speak about those issues here?
Because she actually mentioned about her life being in danger. I think at the end of the day...
And you know the right to life is sacrosanct. But you see, we must find ourselves at a point where we look at each other in the eye and say there is a problem here. If it's a question of state capture, let us speak to that state capture. If it's a question of even certain leaders, whether they are political or otherwise business interests.
But still, I don't want to take from her that she spoke about what she spoke about by fleeing. I mean, I think that was an act of bravery.
By resisting the devil, she fled.
Well, no, we have seen people, her colleague died because of this. I mean, there's no heroism about it.
And also, I think we get caught up in all the wrong stuff. Here we are complaining that she should have spoken from here. Well, you know what? Can we just deal with the substance of what she said? And what she said was later echoed by the same chairman, you know, who I think for me, part of the issue that we heard from him was he readily admitted, I am the only lawyer on this commission. And even on legal issues where I feel that they do not understand, I can't take a position. You know, I mean, to me, that was an incredible, incredible statement. And I think it was a plea for help. I wondered why he didn't independently appeal to the Supreme Court, because he could have done that. But he definitely put in the public domain, I am not able to do what it is I think I should do. And that's where I think that when we talk about institutions, what we can address ourselves to, which you have said and I agree with, is this political interference. And it is both Jubilee and NASA.
Because you speak about having trust in these institutions, but sometimes it's this political class that actually instruct us on who to trust, who not to trust. Do we have, as Kenyans, have our own independent, view at these things? But looming, let's take a look at this. In just a few hours or days, the IEBC could, call this election. And there are those 4 counties where elections have not taken place. What then would it mean in that space where we have these people who have not gone to the ballot to vote? Would this still hold? Does it even matter? Is it consequential that they haven't voted? When
you look at the very content of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and Matters election, when you look at the SEHPR, a very fine instrument on the African continent, and even the ICCPR, and even our very own constitution, when you also look at our Elections Act, you realize that that very right to vote cannot be taken away by any person. And it's a right that is not donated to any individual by the state. All right?
And also there is the right to not vote.
And that is a fact. And even the right to withhold the decision to vote is individual. All right? Now, the thing is this. IEBC, yes, on security grounds, has determined that that election could not be conducted today and has been postponed indefinitely.
Right.
That there, of course, is a moment of confusion for us. It is important that, of course, knowing that within the 60-day period granted by the Supreme Court and the law itself, that by November 1st, that election should have been done. They have got only those few days and none outside that.
Right.
All right? To conduct this election.
Unless they go to the Supreme Court.
Yes, unless they go back to the same body to determine otherwise.
Right.
So right now, as we're looking at the issues, it is important for IEBC to work with another key institution, another key organ in this country, which is the security organ, to make sure that the security of the election officers, as they had, of course, harangued about, is guaranteed. And the moment that is guaranteed, working together, all of them are government institutions that are sustained by the exchequer, then organized to make sure that that election happens before the expiry of the 60-day period.
Right. So it must happen.
It must happen. Otherwise, they will have disenfranchised all the voters in that area. The moment they do that, I would in fact, of course, refer to the case of Ashby versus White, where a voter's right was held back by an elections officer, and the courts determined otherwise, that in fact it's proper that each voter must always have the right to exercise that vote unless that voter himself or herself determines that they don't want to go and cast that ballot. So it's important for IEBC to make sure that they do not confuse this country by saying that we have suspended indefinitely. The term indefinitely.
Yes.
The term indefinitely itself connotes
but
that
how
they...
indefinite can it be? Because we know this has to happen.
I totally disagree.
I
think that it is possible for IEBC to have done what they've done, which is postpone indefinitely. The Elections Amendment Act of 2016 allow them to actually declare a result if they believe the areas in which they've postponed would not have an effect on the outcome. And it doesn't look like there would be an effect on the outcome. I actually think the bigger issue, and we need, this is where we also have to understand what the politics is. The bigger issue is, what kind of state can't conduct an election in 4 counties?
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of state manages to hold down protesters in Nairobi but can't conduct an election in 4 counties? I mean, we have serious issues with the state here. And it's not about a show of military might. It is that the state seems to be resorting to the use of force because it is basically saying everything else is off the table. Well, you know what? If those 4 counties are saying they don't want an election, why is it the first response has been a show of force? You know, I mean, we heard that they delivered election materials. We saw the pictures on TV. I mean, they're frightening pictures, even just watching them trying to deliver those materials.
But what the government has said is that we've seen protesters actually attacking some of the, you know, the officials and even police stations. So saying that the force that they are using could almost equate that the force that police is using in retaliation.
So then I think this is where, and we had a very interesting word from the Deputy President today that I would really urge Kenyans to pay an enormous amount of attention to, because I think it's an escalation that bothers me. We had the use of the term militia, and I think that's a very dangerous escalation, because really the state needs to justify and it needs to explain who exactly is keeping you from opening a polling station. You know, I have not seen on TV, I have not seen anything in a report that shows me that there is the amount of force in terms of equipment or anything
or
that
armory,
would keep them, or armory, that would keep them from doing that. That would then allow you to say that there's a militia in place. So I'm worried about the escalation. Making sense to you how they've not been able to. And I think they are choosing not to be able to really do this. And then say, as Deputy Ruto said, Deputy President said, you know, some people wanted to vote and they couldn't vote, you know, which he actually said, you know, they were being prevented from voting. And we're hearing overwhelmingly, there are people who said, we are boycotting this election. So I do think that on one level, we need to deal with the politics of it and a little less with the legalities. Leave IEBC to deal with the legalities of that. If there's a petition, it will certainly be an issue. But the politics of it are, how does a state not secure in 4 counties polling stations?
Okay. Let's talk about the situation in okay, you wanted to...
No, it's all right. Fact is that IEBC has to conduct the election. And the other fact is that yes, we've heard that a section of that region of the country, which is the part of the stronghold of NASA, indicating that they will not participate in this election.
Right.
So, yes, IEBC still may go ahead and organize and prepare for that election. We know very well that by way of what we witnessed on the 26th, still people may not turn out to vote.
To vote, yep.
And that should not misguide IEBC not to prepare for that election. However, we know very well that if they open the polling stations on the day that they may elect, and that maybe noon time comes and no one has set foot in the polling stations, then wisdom dictates that they go ahead then to call that election.
Right.
Because people will not have shown up to vote, and it will be clear that there is possibly no interest for them to vote. But those who may want to vote still should go ahead and vote.
Right.
But the other thing is, of course, agreeably, voting and a progressive democratic process requires the guaranteeing of security. We have got a Gazette notice that indicated very clearly various groups termed as militia groups, which were outlawed. Those groups are there and known. But the events that have happened in this country, especially after, on the 26th itself and after, whether it's here in Nairobi, whether it's in other parts of Kenya, in Nyanza, etc., should continue to worry us that actually there could be something stirring up in this country, some rebirth of sorts of various militia groups.
And this is what we are seeing in Kawangware. I mean,
yes,
no one is being certain about exactly who was on the offensive. There is narrative that, the opposition hired goons to go, attack people who went out to vote. There is then the other narrative that the outlawed militia is back on the streets harassing people, and we saw this even during the protests in town. I don't know what kind of a space that speaks to where we are now.
I mean, I think for me, one of the things we really have to ask ourselves as Kenyans is, how is it that we managed to get all the way to October 26th and we didn't have violence, and now we have this instigated violence when Kenyans have actually sort of started to speak back to the political class? I think this is politically instigated violence, and I think both parties are contributing to an environment where they then can say, okay, you know what, this is getting out of hand. Let's deal with the security situation first. And the security language worries me, and it worries me especially because the most vulnerable people during this time tend to be women and children. We've already seen reports of about 60 sexual violence incidents since August 8th, and this is an underreported crime. We have a nurses' strike. So these women and these children are not able, and some men are not able to get medical treatment. So the more we talk about security and militarization and militia, number one, I'm seeing a state abdication of responsibility. And this is a state function. And I do not understand why, C.S. Matiang'i gets to come and lecture us on how to exercise our democratic right and is unable to explain to us how he is then securing our safety and the safety of our property. We really do need to have a little more pushback to the state. And I think this resort to words like militia and vigilante groups is to excuse the state non-action. That I am unwilling to do.
And someone said there's hardly ever spontaneous political or ethnic violence, that it's always very strategic, very, choreographed. The question would be, for example, in Kawangware, who benefits from that kind of war? Who benefits from that kind of conflict?
You see, supported by the crutches of history, every time we go to an election with an incumbent in office, there has always been such kind of issues. Every time. If you look at it, actually from the time of the multi-party democracy being birthed on our land, anytime we've had an incumbent. And that should worry us, because if history cannot teach us some fundamental lessons, then it's only clear from what Marx said, Karl Marx, that at times history repeats itself, of course, first time as tragedy, and second time as farce. And I have seen images of shattered arms and limbs. I've seen images of lifeless bodies following this repeat election, or this fresh election, as was determined by the Supreme Court. I have not heard, in a very convincing and moving way, President Kenyatta and Honorable Raila Odinga come out, one, to condemn and decry the happenings, and secondly, speak out or reach to their support bases and tell them to see sense, to embrace calm, and look forward. I have not heard. And you know I'm not new in Jerusalem. I am not new in this country. It is important that President Kenyatta, being the man now whose shoulders must be broad enough to handle the progress, the security of this country, because he's got the instruments of power, to demonstrate that leadership. It is also important because Honorable Raila Odinga cannot be left out of this argument, because the clash that we're witnessing, whether it's within the political class or even within their support bases, their individuals or their warring groups, because of the leadership that is there between President Kenyatta and Honorable Odinga.
Right.
It is important that they come out and speak to their people.
I would have agreed with that before I heard Manoa Esupisu this evening. Now, I believe that silence is itself a message. That silence from President Kenyatta, that silence from Raila Odinga is a message. That the violence is acceptable for us. It can work in our interests. And until they speak, exactly. So until they speak, my position would be, we need to see what is there before us and not what we wish it were. Because their silence, I mean, you gave him every opportunity. Every opportunity to express even just empathy or regret at the loss of life, and there was nothing. So that silence is a message. I think also Kenyans, one of the things we are starting to realize is we need to take care of ourselves. Clearly, the violence is not affecting them.
Right.
So they don't seem to think that it's something that they need to speak about. So we need to be the ones who take the lead on speaking out against violence. And the truth is, the violence isn't widespread.
Right.
Kenyans continue to deal with other Kenyans from different ethnicities. Their lives haven't been affected in that way. They're not pulling back. And that's a deliberate choice.
Do you feel like there's a cause for worry across the country from what we saw in Kawangware, which was clearly very ethnic-based kind of attacks and violence?
Not if it's instigated. And this is why I think it's really important that we're very clear about this, is if we're not seeing tensions between ethnicities, we're seeing sporadic, isolated acts of of violence that do seem to have some sort of coordination to them, then it's not a reflection of what's going on. Yeah, it's not a reflection of what's going on between ordinary people. And what I'm hearing from a lot of ordinary people, from, the taxi guy to, the lady who works at my house, is, sijui vile hizi vitu zinaenda. It's a disconnection. It's a, no, this is not my fight, which is not what we had in 2006, 2007. It's not the same situation.
Is it the same sense you're getting? That,
well, what comes clear to me is that leaders in this country do not respect our constitution, do not respect the values of this nation as domiciled in Article 10 of the Constitution. They do not respect at all. And because we do not respect those values and our constitution, they do not as well respect the institutions that are there. Because leaders do not respect those institutions and our laws and the rule of law itself, even the led, which is the people, do not also respect those institutions, do not respect the constitution. Otherwise, if we did, by respecting a value that is the rule of law, a value that is about our cohesion, about sustainability of a nation and the character of our nation, we would not be seeing what we are seeing today. And what continues to be witnessed is that ethnic profiling continues to occupy a central place in our politics. And that our politicians are very keen to continue milking ethnic profiling for their own good. And that itself is a very sad state of affairs. What also we are coming to a realization, especially those who see sense, is that our politicians do not have any interest to embrace wisdom. And we are also missing serious leadership in this country. And just to put that
what would wisdom be in this?
I would put that into context. And maybe citing the Greek poet Aeschylus, I would say and quote, that even in our sleep, pain which does not forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And against our own will comes wisdom through the grace of God. End of quote. The lack of fearing God by our leaders itself is leading our leaders to darkness, those corners of darkness are the ones that are breeding what we are seeing today.
So you would encourage the fear of God as a beginning of wisdom?
Indeed, it's written, and I did not write the scripture.
But can I say,
Yes.
I think that this is a mistake we keep making. We have great leadership that we are seeing in Kenya today. It's just not coming from the political class. It's not coming from KEPSA. It's not coming from Jubilee as a party or ODM or Wiper. It is coming from ordinary Kenyans. And I think part of what we need to start saying is leadership is not a title. I mean, we've seen MPs fighting, making ridiculous statements that completely are just so disconnected from the pain that Kenyans are feeling right now. And what have we seen Kenyans do? They've taken it. They've said, okay, we need to go through this process. We have not responded in the... I mean, really, Kenyans are justified in being extremely angry. And yet what they've done is they've acted with restraint. They've acted with an enormous amount of dignity and respect. What we are lacking is a reciprocal response from the political class, from the business leadership, from the religious leadership. I mean, that's just empty. I don't know what happened.
A lot of silence from that
It's not even just silence. It is a choice to speak behind closed doors on issues such as the death of children that must be condemned in public. I mean, injustices cannot become these things that we want to somehow politicize. You know, we have to be able to call out injustices, and they're happening
what is wrong
by both
is wrong.
sides.
There's nothing political
There's nothing political about
a
it.
child, you know, being a victim of
or someone dying in their house. You know?
But you know, Sharon, we have always been wrong as a country, and we remained wrong. We were wrong when we thought that the beginning of multi-party politics would save us. And even Moi, in some records, you know, warned us that some of the politicians would lead you into the abyss through this multi-party politics. We were wrong when we thought that through the IPPG process, we would move forward in electoral progress. We remained wrong when we thought that having the new constitution 2010 would find ourselves in the kingdom of a democratic progress that would save us completely from this kind of shame.
All these instances you cite, I want to, you know, go in history as the very democratic process
they remain democratic
of the country.
And in fact, they have always helped us to pull up our socks from around the anklets. But how come we continue walking with pain in our very anklets because of our politics? Because after the multi-party politics since 1992, 1997, except the 2002 elections, which were in a way impressively revolutionary, when you come to 2007, that pain, that jack in the knee remained there.
All right, because we have just about a minute to wrap up our discussion. What would you say are the options that Uhuru Kenyatta, who is likely to be sworn in any time soon, in moving the country forward? And what are the options for Raila Odinga? What are the options?
Well, the only option is that none of them has got an option but to save this country and so, you know, demonstrate leadership. It's not a question of the likelihood of President Kenyatta being sworn in for his second term. It is obvious as the sun rises from the east and sets in the west. It's going to happen. All right?
Right. So what is
but the question is,
the imminent
upon
president?
rededication of those instruments of power in his good arms, what does he intend to do with them? It is proper that President Kenyatta demonstrates magnanimity unparalleled and show leadership and show grace, because it's upon that office that the grace of God even rests on
But how
leadership.
does he pull in this almost half the country that's, you know...
First, he has to accept that he doesn't have half the country, which between the president and the deputy president, they do not speak as if they don't have half the country. And that's the biggest problem. That first of all, we really must accept we are a divided nation. You do not have 70% plus one. Roho safi. Na si kwa ubaya. And the issues that are keeping you from that are issues not of ethnicity. They are of exclusion, lack of inclusion, of women, of people from minority communities, of also just an overpopulation of state institutions with a few tribes. And that's just got to be something we deal with, and a lot of men, because they always seem to be men. Apparently, these tribes don't seem to have a lot of women.
I see Javas.
No,
We're going to have that
Javas is going to
conversation.
wait for a bit. So I think that one of the things is we really need an acceptance that we're divided as a nation. We need an acceptance that we have issues as Kenyans. Can we prioritize Kenyan issues?
Truth should be the starting point.
And it's not just truth. It is, we have a nurses' strike. Solve that. We have a looming food shortage. You know, we have an enormously handicapped economy right now, in large part because of the election. And these statements of militia are not helping. You know, so we really need to start to see demonstrations of the centering of Kenyan people in our politics. And Kenyan people means our issues, the things that matter to us, you know. And I would also add that the other thing we need to state unequivocally to whoever will be declared president. I'm not as confident as he is about the sun, you know. Tomorrow might be different, you never know. Is that we really have to be unequivocal about the Constitution. Constitutional compliance is not optional. And that's one of the things that Jubilee has been very consistent about.
All right. We really have to close our conversation from this. I know off the cameras we'll talk about that. How it's always the men in this
It's
situation.
always
Javas
the
will
men.
take out on that. So thank you very much, Marilyn Kamoro and Javas Bigambo, both lawyers, both governance experts, for your voice on the state of the nation. And that's where we wrap up KTN Weekend Prime tonight. Many thanks for watching. My name is Sharon Omanyi. Have a good night and God bless.